I wanted to start by saying good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Brooke Rogers, and I am the Deputy Head of the Department of War Studies. I would like to extend a warm welcome to King's College London and to thank you for joining us to celebrate the first anniversary of the King's Wargaming Network. It's also an opportunity to say the beginning of our fond farewells to Phil Sabin, who's been with King's for 35 years. He was very kind and said I wasn't born yet when he began here, but I don't think that's true. In fact, I'm quite sure it's not. Phil has assured me that he intends to stay involved with the department and the network, and we will keep in touch with him and welcome him back with open arms, and also ask for his advice and input through his many, many years of experience in this area moving forward. I was looking over the creation of the Wargaming Network as I was away when it was created, and I was looking over some of the old notes, and I saw that Professor Wynne Bowen, the head of the School of Security Studies, set this firmly within the vision of the college, driving the creation of the Wargaming Network during his opening remarks at the network launch last year. He noted that the School of Security Studies identified wargaming as a priority area in line with the King's Vision 2029, with the goals of advancing and democratizing wargaming education, developing wargaming as an academic discipline, and applying wargaming to generate and deliver big ideas in service to society. As such, the King's Wargaming Network has been designed to serve as a hub that enables engagement with world-class wargaming scholars, practitioners, and emerging talents, and invests in a diverse community of staff and students interested in being involved in studying, researching, and applying games and simulations. It's very much looking at the way in which we understand the issues theoretically and looking at the real-world applications and the impact of those theories on real-world applications, both pushing and pulling ideas and methods into and out of the network. Overall, the network is committed to advancing wargaming as a method of inquiry and as a method of learning and teaching. It has been a busy but successful year for the fledgling King's Wargaming Network. I had the pleasure of reading one of the reports on the activities, and it was reams and reams of funding, of projects, of outreach, of input, and I have to admit I run quite a few projects, and I wish that I had the momentum and the level of activity that the Wargaming Network has had in just 1 year. The network has pulled together previously disconnected elements of King's staff expertise to provide a foundation for future institutional excellence and growth. In doing so, King's has rapidly gained global recognition as a hub for generating and disseminating innovative thinking on adapting wargaming methods to address emerging security challenges. The general consensus, as we look at the activities and the impact and the agenda moving forward, is that the Wargaming Network has exceeded initial expectations in the form of research, training, outreach, and publications. So it's been a very exciting year. And these successes and engagements have bred the appetite and the opportunity for more engagement moving forward, future collaboration, and future funding. This success is driven by the involvement of key UK and international stakeholders in the development and refinement of strategy, as well as peer review feedback on reports and agenda setting and participation at all Wargaming Network events. The strategy is built upon 5 key objectives. The first is to build and develop a demonstrable institutional capacity to lead in wargaming research and education. The second is to develop, test, and refine a strategy for long-term competitive advantage. Third is to empirically demonstrate an urgent academic and policy need for wargaming research and education, adopting a unique King's approach to measure the progress towards addressing this need. Fourth is to develop and communicate a King's Wargaming research and education brand to increase the university's global profile. And I've seen quote after quote where dignitaries and international partners are noting that King's is very much the go-to place, the leader in terms of wargaming thinking and practice. And finally, number 5, I think I skipped 4, to develop and communicate a King's Wargaming research and education brand to increase the university's global profile. And 5th, to develop external partnerships that help further objectives 1 to 4 and create the potential for external funding. I expect that Phil is going to reflect upon the many successes in realizing the strategy, as well as identifying the challenges and the tasks ahead. A few highlights include obtaining funding for key Wargaming Network staff on temporary contracts in order to enable the processes, enable events like this, think about research objectives, and help move everything forward. In October 2018, the Center for Science and Security Studies awarded Ivanka Barzashka a 2-year fellowship supported by the MacArthur Foundation, which has allowed her to co-direct the Wargaming Network with Phil Sabin. In June 2019, the Department of War Studies offered Aggie Hurst, who has served as a network academic lead, a permanent contract as a lecturer in international theory and methods. And finally, in January 2019, the Department of Defense Study accepted Anna Nettleship, a King's Conflict Simulation Model alumnus, to begin PhD studies with a wargaming component. And this has allowed her to serve as a part-time wargaming network coordinator. Looking to the future, the Department of War Studies has just advertised and recruited a lecturer in war studies with a focus on wargaming. Other activities and outputs were tailored to engage key stakeholders and leading experts to better understand and demonstrate the current academic and policy needs. Wargaming Network events over 6 months included 877 registered participants from 22 countries. For example, the public lecture series on wargaming resulted in 3 lectures with 572 registered attendees from 19 countries. Podcasts of the 3 lectures had 12,319 listeners on SoundCloud from 4th December 2018 to 4th August 2019, and 3,070 viewers on YouTube. Additionally, the Wargaming Network finds itself facing one notable strategic challenge that I think they really weren't expecting. It's produced a level of, the Wargaming Network concept has produced a level of global engagement beyond what they originally conceived. It has galvanized such a diverse community of interests who wish to be members of the network that they really, really need to think of the ways that they're going to enable this community and enable this engagement in order to realize the impacts that they hope to achieve. Finally, I had the opportunity to be involved in the recruitment process for the War Studies lectureship with expertise in wargaming. In doing so, I discovered that I am a closet wargamer. I didn't actually really think I knew what the concept meant, and I sat and listened to the individuals presenting and thinking, this links to my field. I'm a behavioral scientist myself. I've always been a little bit of an odd fit in war studies, but we're an incredibly multidisciplinary community. And I think that my colleagues who are sitting in that room have moved from looking through the windows and watching everyone working through the simulations and playing the games to actually seeing links with their own research. My behavioral science approach utilizes crisis simulation and exercising whilst examining the impact of information or communication injects during extreme events. I'm excited that I've actually discovered links with a whole new world and look forward to learning about and applying wargaming theories and techniques to my own work. I will now hand over to Ivanka Barzashka and Phil Sabin to lead the charge on our discussions this evening. And the main topic of focus is what is the future of wargaming as a method of inquiry and as a method for learning and teaching. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Rogers. It's always a pleasure to hear that our report, something that we've written, is so well received by our heads of department, and indeed in founding the Wargaming Network, this was possible by the support of the Department of War Studies, by the School of Security Studies, and by the Faculty of Social Science and Public Policy. So we're very, very grateful for the support that our leadership has provided. So ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the Wargaming Network, I'm delighted to welcome you to our public lecture on the future of wargaming. And so this lecture concludes 2 days of events here at King's College in London to mark 3 important milestones. The first, as Professor Rogers mentioned, is the celebration of the first anniversary of the Wargaming Network. So we established the Wargaming Network in December 2018 with the aims of advancing wargaming as a method of inquiry and as a method for learning and teaching. And we did so as a reflection of intellectual humility at a strategic inflection point. a recognition that we need improved tools for understanding and addressing security problems, in addressing security challenges in a new era marked by major power rivalry. So second, we're celebrating the network's co-director and co-founder, Professor Phil Sabin, for his 35-year contribution to the university and to society. And third, we're hosting the first King's Alumni Weekend, bringing together students, staff, and alumni who are playing and will continue to play important roles in the revival of wargaming across the globe. Over the past year, we have organized activities around the issue and the problem of examining fundamental challenges for adapting wargaming theory and practice to usefully address contemporary security problems facing the UK and its NATO allies. In this process, we've learned three things. The first is that there is a gap between the high policy interest and expectation that wargaming can deliver. So we have a policy expectation that is quite high, and at the same time we have the state of the art in wargaming theory and practice, which is significantly below that expectation. So this brings about the need to close that gap by developing an academic discipline of wargaming, a discipline that advances wargaming as both a method of inquiry, looking at analytical war games, but also as a method for learning and teaching. Third, we have learned that we need to regain the habit of wargaming as a tool for innovation and as a tool for understanding complex security challenges. So to address these needs, King's Wargaming Network is organizing its 2019-2020 activities around the theme, Building the Future of Wargaming. We're doing so by bringing together three communities: academics, professional wargamers, and policymakers. And we're doing so by fostering a diverse and inclusive environment and by working together with allies and partners. So tonight's lecture on the future of wargaming bridges these two themes. It's an opportunity to look back and take stock of progress, and also to look forward and to identify opportunities and risks. So it is my distinct honor to introduce Professor Phil Sabin. I, like many of the people in the room, I am one of Phil's students. I'm one of his PhD students, and we're all here to celebrate his lifetime achievement. So Professor Sabin needs no introduction, but instead I will introduce him through the words of others, starting with Howard Bodie, who is currently heads the new unit for strategic net assessment at the Ministry of Defense, who said that almost single-handedly in the UK, Professor Sabin generated and built a cadre of professional wargaming practitioners. The Ministry of Defense has benefited from a flow of suitably prepared postgraduate students who have joined government service and have been instrumental in building an effective core of wargaming expertise. Dr. Peter Perla, who is the author of The Art of Wargaming, said that Professor Sabin has played a driving role in expanding the recognition and application of wargaming for exploring human decision-making in historical and contemporary situations involving conflict and competition. His courses at King's and his published works, especially his critically acclaimed Lost Battles and Simulating War, the Simulating War book you can find you can purchase a copy in the back of the room, and Phil will be around to sign books later on if you wish. So these published works have educated and inspired new generations to pursue the academic and professional application of good gaming practice. His role in creating the UK Connections Professional Wargaming Conference and the King's Wargaming Network have established King's as the premier European center of excellence drawing to King's practitioners from around the world. And we can see this tonight. So, ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, Professor Phil Sabin.
First find the lecture. It's in here somewhere. Wouldn't that be a problem? Right, and now find my slide. 1 second. That's the one. And there we are. Okay, so thank you, Brooke and Ivanka, for those wonderful introductions, and they've given you a good feeling, of course, for the great successes of the Wargames network. Due, I have to say, more to Ivanka than to myself. She's really been utterly stellar in this regard. It's an honor and a pleasure on the eve of my early retirement. I hope that the early part is at least possibly evident, from King's College, to have the opportunity to take stock of the field of wargaming around which my academic studies increasingly have revolved. I'm especially pleased to be able to do so before such a large audience of friends, old and new, from across my long career. Wargaming today, of course, is very much in vogue. In September, the UK's Defence Minister spent an hour at King's visiting our biggest ever professional wargaming conference, and 2 years ago, the Vice Chief of the Defence Staff opened the new UK Wargaming Handbook by writing, as you can see there. Even universities, which had traditionally paid far less attention to wargaming than to other scholarly techniques, such as game theory or operational analysis, OA, are taking more interest in wargaming as an alternative way of understanding conflict. Just a few years ago, I wrote that, quote, "When I retire, my modules will probably be replaced with more conventionally taught ones, and wargaming at King's will disappear with hardly a ripple." In fact, as you have heard, King's not only has recruited another academic with a wargaming specialism to take my place, Dr. David Banks, who will arrive next summer. We've also, as you've heard, established the King's Wargaming Network, co-directed by my colleague Ivanka, and on top of the annual Connections UK Professional Wargaming Conference, one of several now held across the world, running at King's since 2013 and attracting hundreds of attendees from dozens of countries. So why is wargaming so much in vogue, and what contribution can it make? That's the Connections Conference. The very definition of wargaming is surprisingly problematic. Retiring US wargame expert Dr. Peter Perler supplied the most widely used definition in his classic 1990 book. He lectured here at King's last December, and he slimmed down that definition to what you can see there. The focus is on people and decisions. This distinguishes wargaming from operational analysis, with its focus on the quantifiable scientific modeling of conflict. If I were asked to define a wargame in as few words as possible, I would opt for something similar to this, perhaps a dynamic model of conflict shaped by player decisions. Many so-called wargames consist of little more than large, unstructured discussions, be they about military issues or broader challenges such as Brexit. To my mind, what distinguishes wargames from mere discussions or training exercises is not the iconic representational elements of maps and counters, but rather two more fundamental attributes: the explicit role-playing of different groups seeking to achieve conflicting objectives, and the ability to adjudicate the outcome of these groups' interacting tactical or strategic choices, so that the game progresses through a series of unscripted rounds, in each of which the players must deal with the consequences of previous events and decisions. Now, of course, wargames are just one niche element of an enormous range of synthetic adversarial contests, which includes all types of sports and games. Clausewitz famously wrote that there's an analogy to wargaming, to war. It's not wargaming, because it hadn't been popularized in his day, but it is a Kartenspiel, a game of cards. This apparently bizarre analogy reflects the fact that adversarial games artificially generate the kind of stark conflictual relationship which is so characteristic of war, but which is relatively rare in other kinds of human interactions. It's no accident that war games proper, designed to resemble real war, deliberately rather than coincidentally, like cards, were developed very soon after Clausewitz's day in the form of the famous Prussian Kriegspiel. And that's what one early skeptic said about Kriegspiel. For 2 centuries, war games like this have been played as a way of studying and understanding the changing tactical and strategic dynamics of conflict without the appalling human and material costs of learning from the hard school of war itself. Now, war games take many forms, but perhaps the most fundamental distinction is between those based on a mathematical model of reality and those which rely on the real-world experience of game players and controllers. In the first type, one or more designers create an entire self-contained game universe, akin to the rules and components of chess, within which players may compete without the designers themselves having to be present, without even the need for an umpire to decide who prevails, since everything is laid out in the game rules. In the second type of war game, like the free Kriegspiel on the right, there are no artificial rules. The game works only by the players and umpires constantly shaping their decisions and judgments in the synthetic scenario according to what seems to them realistic if the events were occurring for real. Rules-based war games today have the significant advantage that they can be programmed into computers via a string of binary code, thereby creating a pick-up-and-play experience in which players are presented with a graphically intuitive display of the information which they would have available within the virtual world. A good example is the widely used VBS training system, in which each soldier's network computer screen shows only that avatar's real-time first-person perspective in the evolving scenario. As artificial intelligence, AI, and machine learning continue to progress, it also becomes possible for computers to imitate effectively the decisions of human players in rules-based games. We see that, of course, through the growing AI mastery, not only of chess, but now also of vastly more complex games such as Go and StarCraft. As Air Marshal Stringer said in his lecture here in April, this potentially allows automated iteration and repetition of war games, overcoming the limited availability of live human players, blurring thereby the boundary between wargaming, game theory, and operational analysis. But the downside of computerization, of course, is that designing and programming software capable of modeling the enormous complexities of real war is costly, time-consuming, and very technically challenging. This explains the remarkable persistence, alongside computer war games, of manual rules-based war games using the same basic technology of maps and counters as in the original Kriegspiel 2 centuries ago, since even non-programmers can understand and tweak such games as they see fit. An excellent example shown here is the UK's Rapid Campaign Analysis toolset. This was commissioned after the Libya War of 2011, revealed the inflexibility of available computer war games in coming to grips quickly enough with such unexpected challenges. Physical maps and playing pieces also offer a more attractive and socially interactive play experience. And so some war games, like my own Lost Battles system, like the Signal game developed by the Carnegie-funded Project on Nuclear Gaming, use these physical components wherever possible, even though they've also, as you can see, been digitized for play on computer screens. So that's rules-based war games. War games which depend partly or entirely on player experience and judgment, rather than formal rules, lack the comprehensive mathematical models which are a precondition for full computerization. talking war games such as this are the most common form in use by governments, armed forces, and universities today. They don't require any familiarity with artificial game rules, and they're flexible enough to model anything from platoon attacks, as here, to international crises. And by the way, the guy there, Tom Mowat, sitting just there, is one of our leading defence war gamers with his head in his hands there. But he's there advisedly and deservedly in several of my slides. The cost of this flexibility and accessibility is that such war games depend critically on the knowledge, design expertise, self-confidence and standing of game controllers such as Tom. On the many occasions when inexperienced individuals are tasked to run a war game, the activity usually degenerates rapidly into a mere discussion session or rubber stamping exercise. And even if experienced game controllers are available, adjudication of events and outcomes in judgment-based war games raises severe dilemmas in its own right. In rules-based war games, stochastic variation due to the multiplicity of detailed variables may be allowed for through simple randomization of individual outcomes within a specific range using random number generators or dice or whatever. In judgment-based games, however, it's tempting for umpires to select what they consider to be the individually most likely outcome at every stage of the game. Actually, of course, this makes the overall pattern of events in the game far too average, since individually unlikely surprises or accidents become statistically almost inevitable in the real world after enough different events. Not everything happens the most likely way. Game controllers can instead exploit their godlike authority by deliberately seeking plausible but worst-case outcomes, which test the players to the maximum. Those running flight simulators and injecting multiple systems failures are a good example of that approach. We adopted this kind of what I've called rather tongue-in-cheek satanic adjudication in our recent Carnegie-funded nuclear crisis war games at King's, as you can see here. The object being to make it harder for the teams to step back from the brink. But by doing so, this kind of instrumental selection of outcomes by game controllers distorts the representativeness of wargame results and may, of course, make players feel like puppets of capricious and subjective authority. So overall, each type of wargame has enduring strengths and limitations. No single type, I think, seems likely to supersede the others in future. However, technology may change. Now, let me come to a further aspect which is uppermost in a number of people's minds from the discussions we had yesterday, the issue of recreational wargaming. In the 1960s, wargaming became quite a popular recreational activity for ordinary people, almost all male, I have to say, interested in military history. And then when computer and console games, with their ever-increasing processing power and graphics capabilities, developed from the 1980s onwards, wargames such as the Call of Duty or Command and Conquer series became truly mass-market entertainment products, played by an ever-increasing proportion of young people around the world. And that's even if one discounts the parallel rise of fantasy games such as Dungeons and Dragons and Unreal. Professional wargaming has had a decidedly ambivalent relationship with this growing wargame hobby. On the one hand, many professionals, including myself, play and perhaps design hobby games in their spare time, thereby honing their experience with game mechanisms. Unlike the great majority of professional wargames, hobby wargames are unclassified and openly available, and they've now built up into a massive corpus of many thousands of different titles, accompanied by lengthy reviews in specialist journals and hobby websites. The best recreational wargames are at least as detailed and well-researched as most professional wargames, and have often been adapted as commercial off-the-shelf COTS products for professional use. Again, the VBS computer game, as you can see here, in its civilian incarnation, being perhaps the prime example. On the other hand, the most popular and famous hobby wargames, like Call of Duty, are very much entertainment products. Their yawning Hollywood-style inaccuracies tend to sully professional wargaming by association, despite attempts to distinguish the latter with the epithet serious games. Air Marshal Stringer here in April noted that the rise of the hobby actively stigmatized wargaming in a military culture wedded to more muscular and extrovert diversions than playing soldiers. Dr. Yuna Wong, in her own King's College lecture in January, pointed out that many current wargames professionals develop their skills partly by playing and designing hobby wargames, rather than by branching out from established academic disciplines. And this helps to explain the precarious legitimacy and the theoretical isolation of the wargaming profession. It means that the most experienced wargame practitioners often lack formal disciplinary credentials of the kind which Dr. Wong hopes to develop through new academic programs in the wargame field. And the biggest difference between professional and recreational wargames is that almost all the professional games model contemporary or potential future scenarios, while the great majority of the hobby games model wars, as you can see, of the recent or distant past. As a military historian, I'm an exception to this in that my own wargame designs, as published in my 2 latest books, also have an historical focus. They cover conflicts from ancient times to World War II. But, as Robert Citino ruefully notes, most professional military historians tend to shun the commercial wargame as a legitimate tool of knowledge and research. Doubtless, this is because the wars concerned have already happened, and they're seen, therefore, as sufficiently accessible through traditional scholarly techniques of interviews and archival study, with no need for more innovative approaches, such as model building and counterfactual speculation. Although wargaming has certainly become more respectable recently in universities as a technique for studying present and future conflict scenarios, its utility to cast extra light on past conflicts seems likely to remain controversial, to say the least. The saving grace of historical wargames is that they allow rule systems to be trialed and refined against situations with a known course and outcome, thereby helping to make their use in studying future scenarios a little less speculative. This is my office and the RCAT system that I mentioned, with Graham Longley Brown, who's also here, by the way, as the designer, key designer, and being played in a Falklands 1982 scenario, using that historical scenario for validation purposes, and we had the privilege of having 2 of the key amphibious commanders of the British side actually there and playing, and very impressed they were, despite our trepidations. Let's move to the human element. As I said at the outset, what distinguishes wargaming from automatic simulation models of conflict is the central role of player decisions in shaping how the contest proceeds. Just as in a game of chess, it takes players to animate the simulated forces and capabilities reflected in the scenario and game rules, and to decide how to employ them to best effect as they struggle for advantage. The most effective wargames often are those which model real-world contests in which there are few, if any, effective limits on what can be done, except for those imposed by the laws of physics. In such cases, the game system only needs to perform the relatively uncontroversial task of codifying the physical capabilities available to the antagonists, leaving the players free to experiment and duel to their heart's content. Perhaps the most famous success in wargame history fell into precisely this category. From 1942 onwards, the Royal Navy's Western Approaches Tactical Unit, WATU, managed to model the known physical characteristics of merchant vessels, escorts, and U-boats in terms of speed, turning circle, visibility, armament, and so on, allowing players, including, as you can see, many young women representing the opposing captains, to experiment assiduously to discover the best tactics to protect the convoys. Paul Strong from DSTL is here, I think, and he is someone who's written extensively on this WATU example. If we had a similar challenge today, doubtless we could tackle it even more quickly and effectively, we'd simply apply computer AI programs like AlphaZero and DeepMind to come up with the optimum approach, just as they've done to games like Go. Unfortunately, the kind of challenge faced by Watu increasingly is the exception rather than the rule. And I see two big problems with using wargame techniques, whether with human or AI players, to study more representative modern tactical or strategic challenges. First, wargames by their very nature have one inevitable artificiality, namely that unlike in real war, nobody really dies. Now, I'm not sorry about that. It's obviously a very welcome characteristic. It allows users to learn from their mistakes without the fatal consequences of similar experiential learning in real conflicts. But the safe-to-fail nature of wargames means that they often struggle to model situations in which human factors like morale and self-preservation have a major influence alongside purely physical constraints. In the brutal convoy battles modelled by Watu, the morale of the individual sailors had little impact on their ability to survive. But in land or air battles, where individual combatants face constant choices over how far to expose themselves to the storm of enemy fire, morale plays a much more important role. First-person shooter games are notoriously prone to encourage gung-ho behaviour because of the unrealistically low stakes involved, since they miss the enormous suppressive effect of visceral fear when the bullets and shells are real. At the strategic level, the advent of nuclear weapons moved us to a very different strategic environment than the all-out naval battles modelled by Watu. And in our current age of hybrid warfare, restraint and limitation are even more important influences on how conflicts proceed. With every potential action or reaction in modern brinkmanship contests being weighed carefully to gauge what response it may provoke, how it will play in the constant media battle, our ability to create credible rules-based models of the manifold options from economic sanctions and fake news to cyber attacks, hostage-taking, and drone or missile strikes becomes more and more in doubt. So wargames based instead on judgment and real-world experience may not only keep players more in touch with the visceral fears of escalation which today accompany any hostile action, but they may also give players the freedom they need, the freedom to think outside the box, to devise innovative tactics like China's artificial islands, Russia's little green men, which, as we know, in practice may prove crucial in securing objectives without triggering open conflict. It's interesting that the project on nuclear gaming Signal Game on the left takes the opposite approach. It creates a highly abstract and simplified rules-based model of grand strategic, economic and military competition in an imaginary world up to the level of nuclear strikes. Now, its abstraction, its rules-based character, allows Signal to be played repeatedly by diverse users to generate the kind of numerical data so sought after by US social science today. But some might feel that it creates a rather carefree atmosphere, more akin perhaps to Risk or Diplomacy, than to the dread of escalation, which we tried to capture in our own more one-off Carnegie-funded nuclear crisis war games that you can see on the right, based on real-world scenarios and the real experience of the former officials involved. So that's the first inevitable problem and artificiality with war games today. Second one, even more intractable, I think. Except at the lowest tactical levels, the number of different actors whose views and reactions now need to be considered far exceeds the number of players likely to be practically available. Wargames used to model a fairly straightforward bilateral contest between competing hierarchical organizations. Two players or teams could play the role of the red and blue senior commanders, while simple morale rules limited the sacrifices which the lower ranks were willing to make on their behalf. Now, Conflicts like those in Iraq, Afghanistan, or Syria involve a patchwork of states and factions, each with their own interests and sensitivities, together with non-military actors such as reporters, aid agencies, local civilians, refugees, criminal gangs, commercial enterprises, domestic electorates. Success in modern limited wars, or indeed political struggles within states, requires a deft balance of compromise, coercion, and propaganda to forge temporary coalitions while keeping others divided and disheartened. The current election, by the way, is quite an interesting case study of that. Only mega games, like this one at Connections, with many dozens of participants, come close to reflecting the human complexity of such tangled factional conflicts. And they bring challenges of their own in terms of the practical difficulty of controlling and monitoring the many parallel activities and interactions. Our own Carnegie-funded nuclear crisis games boiled the complexity down to just 4 teams: Russia, the USA, NATO, and Control. This raised difficult questions over the stance of the many individual European states, not to mention the problem that the policies even of a single state are the often dysfunctional result of tangled infighting between many groups and individuals. Again, the UK's prolonged agony over Brexit illustrates that very well. Now, our Control team was able to exploit its responsibility for the policies of flashpoint states such as Lithuania and Ukraine to bring the other teams into conflict. But as I said, this highlights the adjudication dilemma, which I mentioned earlier. You may think, what about using AI? Surely AI could govern the reactions of the great majority of actors who cannot practically be represented by real human players. But especially when you look at the headlines over the last few weeks, and you look at the toxic cocktail of passion, resentment, ambition, incompetence, and deceit, which has shaped recent events around the world from Hong Kong to Chile. You can see how difficult it is to model such wildly unpredictable conflicts in terms of an interacting web of unemotional cost-benefit calculations like those in which computers excel. With dreams of stable technocratic progress in the world looking even more unrealistic as years go on, as crises and conflicts proliferate, the world of the 2020s, it seems to me, poses daunting modeling challenges for even the cleverest and most technically advanced wargame techniques. Okay, let's talk about wargames and education. One frequent objective of professional wargames is to educate users about selected dynamics of the conflict concerned. The presumption of the teachers is that wargames offer a cost-effective way of transmitting the ideas concerned in comparison to other, more traditional educational techniques like lectures or reading assignments. It's easiest to assess the validity of this claim with regard to military training. Tests there can check what proportion of participants have mastered the required lessons sufficiently to move to the next stage of training or to be deployed in operations. But if the educational objectives are broader and less specific, judgments of comparative cost-effectiveness are more difficult. Wargames pretty clearly are not the most efficient way to teach simple facts like names and dates. Instead, they're usually intended to give players a deeper and more enduring feel for the underlying tactical or strategic dynamics of a given type of conflict by involving them in simulated decision-making as part of a process of active learning. Dr. Wong, in her lecture in January, correctly pointed out that wargames are just one of the many forms of games now used for educational purposes, and that in this broader field of game-based learning, theories and metrics have been developed which could be applied to assess the cost-effectiveness of educational wargames despite the difficulties in doing so. She also suggested that the best people to conduct this research are probably not game designers themselves who have vested interests in these things working, but actually other academics more interested in the theory and methodology of wargaming. We're very fortunate here at King's that my colleague, Dr. Aggie Hurst, sitting there, specializes in just this vital complementary field of wargame scholarship. And a key objective of our King's Wargaming Network is to try to develop the disciplinary linkages and theoretical underpinnings which Dr. Wong advocates. One form of wargame education which I heartily recommend is to encourage students not only to play wargames, but to design and run them into the bargain. I already mentioned the design accessibility of manual wargames. In the MA option, which I've run for the past 15 years, I've taught around 200 students in total to research and design a complete mini wargame on a past conflict of their choice. Some of my best students, as you've heard, have gone on to get jobs with organisations like the UK's Defence Science and Technology Laboratory. They're playing a key role in the resurgence of professional wargaming, and some of them, I'm pleased to see, are here today. They also made excellent teaching assistants. They acted as force multipliers by running, as you saw earlier, multiple simultaneous war games in my BA classes and conference sessions. And that addresses one of the key challenges in educational wargaming, namely that it requires a higher staff-student ratio than in conventional lecture or seminar teaching. And a key strength of educational devices, there's that man again, is that they are engaging and fun. Teachers shouldn't be embarrassed by this fact, nor should they be too quick to embrace this defensive epithet of serious games in hopes of evading accusations of frivolity and childishness. I remember at one of our first Connections UK conferences, an RAF education officer made a very wise observation. He reported that when his adult students played a war game, they became like children again. And just like children, they began to learn. The popularity of wargaming as a recreational activity is a major asset for teachers, since education, above all, I think, is about inspiration and infectious enthusiasm. Now to wargames for research. This is the other main objective of professional wargaming, to help users to understand better their current and potential future situation, so that they may adjust their actions to maximize their chance of success and to minimize the risk of disaster. Military units are usually enjoined to wargame their operational plan before execution, to identify weaknesses, to anticipate possible enemy responses. Wargames can be used to guide defence procurement decisions by casting light on the relative cost effectiveness of different capability options. At a broader level, policymakers and defence academics since the 1960s have played Pole Mill games to explore the dynamics of international crises, to seek ways of achieving national objectives while minimising the risk of war. And it's also become routine for election campaigns or divisive issues like Brexit to be wargamed by different factions as they try to discover the best policies to adopt for their sectional advantage. As usual, an ideal example of a successful research wargame is Watu, this book just literally published, hot off the press, by Simon Parkin. In Watu, the variables were sufficiently limited and calculable that constant iteration between the game and real ongoing operational experience in the Atlantic allowed the Watu team to develop a highly effective tactical model of reality. When new threats such as acoustic homing torpedoes were encountered, Captain Roberts and his Wrens were able to devise a response in short order. The project on nuclear gaming has made very impressive efforts to adopt similar scientific methods by creating a single, highly repeatable game of nuclear brinkmanship, which can be used to generate statistical insights into whether the injection of new capabilities in the form of small nuclear weapons offers the holder significant deterrent or military advantages. However, although this classic experimental methodology, dependent-independent variables, is entirely valid within the confines of the abstract signal game, it's far from clear that we may safely generalize the findings to the real world, given the passion and terror which, as I said, is likely to characterize such extreme nuclear crises, and their thankful rarity compared to the ongoing convoy battles which kept the Watu model so closely aligned with real experience. Opinions differ about the ability of wargames to go beyond specific research questions like the ones I've just illustrated, and to cast light on what former US Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld will, I'm sure, forever be remembered for, his famous concept of unknown unknowns. Air Marshal Stringer, in his lecture in April, addressed this issue and was very clear. He said, "We cannot wargame. What we do not know, we do not know." I beg to differ. To my mind, wargames, in fact, have an unmatched potential to highlight for us issues which even the game designer had not thought of beforehand. Traditional scholarly research may throw up fascinating new insights in archives or interviews, but presenting this research in books, articles, or lectures merely promulgate these insights rather than creating new ones. War games are different. They are dynamic, interactive systems, and designing and playing them creates new research insights, not programmed in consciously based on the designer's prior understanding. This applies even in my own field of military history. My Lost Battles book developed a common wargame model to reconstruct 36 different ancient battles. In the process of doing so, it threw up novel comparative insights, such as that the depth of units tended to increase with army size rather than remaining constant, as had usually been assumed by scholars hitherto. More recently, I designed 2 tactical wargames of World War II fighter combat. I used them to help support a conference talk in the Royal Aeronautical Society in May on the strengths and weaknesses of the Me-262 jet. Playing the games revealed something that I'd not thought of beforehand, namely that the poor quality of most German pilots by 44-45 was a particular problem when the jet encountered enemy fighters, since its high speed and poor maneuverability required independent bracketing maneuvers, high-angle attacks, and evasive landing approaches, which placed unsustainable demands on the novice's marksmanship, situational awareness, and flying skill. I actually think that insight into these unknown unknowns is the most distinctive and important contribution which wargames can make as investigative tools. Like most wargame experts, I routinely downplay the predictive potential of wargames, since I believe that they're far better at highlighting new questions than providing definitive answers to ones you've already posed. And I think this is well illustrated by the 2 nuclear crisis wargames which we conducted recently at King's. Those wargames were ostensibly to research the potential strategic implications of new missile defense capabilities. And they did indeed yield some interesting insights into the impact or lack of impact which such missile defenses might have on strategic decisions. But much more striking to my mind were the insights we gained into other issues, not explicitly considered in the original game objectives. The Baltic scenario revealed a troubling willingness on the part of player teams to escalate to conventional and even nuclear force on the basis of significant wishful thinking about the enemy's unwillingness to retaliate at each stage. The Ukraine scenario showed how difficult NATO may find it to restrain and disavow possible Allied adventurism without also fatally weakening its deterrence of Russian counteraction. So this experience suggests to me that wargames have more to contribute the broader and more open your research agenda. Narrowly focused questions about specific capabilities may not yield the best research value from wargames once you've gone to all the trouble of creating an entire virtual world with which to experiment. Let me conclude. And while I talk, I put up some sources, websites and books which have appeared recently, very recently in the case of Graham Longley-Browns, who also is here today, from other institutions than just the Wargaming Network, so that you can take a note. Wargaming is a breathtakingly ambitious endeavor, which purports to be able to create playable but tolerably accurate and valid models of the real world, with which one may experiment safely without human or economic sacrifice. To achieve this, it must make heroic simplifications and reduce the unimaginable complexity of the real world to just a few playable entities. Watu's focus was so narrow and technical that its modeling proved effective, but that, I think, was the exception rather than the rule. Modern hybrid crises are so awash with multidimensional global implications, human fear and passion, media saturation, and fake news, that the idea of reducing them to a war game between a handful of player teams seems ridiculously reductionist. Although agent-based computer modeling can help to predict crowd behavior in disaster situations, it's far from clear that it can reliably capture the wild swings seen recently in political developments around the world, as individual events and triggers and the mercurial choices of populist politicians are magnified by instant and pervasive media and social media coverage. This, I think, makes it all the more important to strengthen the linkages between wargaming and related academic disciplines such as design theory, psychology, play-based learning, sociology, cognitive theory, organizational learning, and futurology, to name but a few. Now that limits and restraints are pervasive, and politics and psychology have moved to center stage, it's vital that we challenge our assumptions and recognize the difficulty of creating intellectually and practically valid wargame or simulation models of contemporary conflict situations. We must validate our models against the growing record of hybrid confrontations in the recent past, to help reveal the limitations of the wargaming models developed during the Cold War or the glory days of Watu. So, does this mean that the current striking resurgence of wargaming as one of a range of methods which can help us to understand and overcome future challenges is ill-founded and unsustainable? Well, you'll not be surprised to hear, perhaps, that I believe otherwise. I once suggested that there are no losers in wargames, only winners and learners. Wargames, as I've said, offer a safe-to-fail experimental environment. And given the sad litany of policy failures in our own recent history, anything which may help us to avoid or mitigate at least some similar failures in future is a welcome tool in our intellectual arsenal. With judicious embrace of new technology, with increasing integration with other academic disciplines, we can pass the torch from old stagers like Peter Perler and myself to a new generation which will use wargames ever more effectively to address the daunting challenges ahead. Thanks very much.